Hello, I'm Marilyn Vanderburg. Have you ever wondered why some people excel and become outstanding in certain fields? People like Neil Sedaka, Jesse Owens, Vince Lombardi, Ayn Rand. Because they were born with natural ability, I'll be talking about them and others. Because before I began learning about people's lives, I thought most people excelled because they had a natural ability for their field. For example, I always thought an author just sat down and began writing. The words would just flow naturally. I recently read this statement: a good writer never has a vacation. For a good writer, life consists of either writing or thinking about writing. Ernest Hemingway received the Nobel Prize for The Old Man and the Sea. It was amazing to me that he sat down and wrote 1,000 words a day, but this was his average for 26 days. What most people don't know is that he'd been thinking about this book for 16 years. For 16 years, he had thought about it, planned it, even worded it. He may have written the book in 26 days, but he had really been writing it in his mind for 16 years. One of the great magazine writers in America is Richard Merriman. He writes about people, Carol Burnett, Burt Reynolds. He says the perfect interview is a perfect set of questions. For every hour he spends interviewing a person, he spends an average of 5 hours on preparation, interviewing people who know the subject, working out his questions. He says for about 3 days before the interview, I try to get a great deal of sleep. I don't eat starch or sugar. I spend half the day in bed and then eat steak for breakfast. He literally trains before interviewing. Irving Stone is one of my favorite authors. He wrote the biographies of Michelangelo, Clarence Darrow. One of his bestsellers was the biography of Freud. To learn all he could about him, he literally moved to Vienna, Austria, where Freud had lived. He spent 6 years doing research and writing. Ayn Rand is one of America's best-known authors. Her book, Fountainhead, has sold over 2 million copies. The theme of this book is the importance of the individual. She decided the best way she could develop this theme was through a man she would call Howard Rourke, an architect who does not follow tradition, who makes his own decisions, who stands by his personal ideals at all costs. After selecting architecture as Rourke's profession, and before she had written one word of the book, she plunged into 2 years of incredible research. For more than a year, she just read about the history of architecture, the aesthetics, architectural engineering. She read professional journals, biographies of architects. Finally, she felt she was ready for practical experience. So she went to work in an architect's office. Only the man who hired her knew that her real purpose in working there was research for a novel. For 2 years, she had done research and lived with architecture. All this before she had written one word of the novel. It took her 7 years to write Fountainhead. Some years later, she met the most famous architect in America, perhaps the best-known architect even today, Frank Lloyd Wright. He said, "I've read every word of Fountainhead. Your grasp of the architectural ins and outs astonishes me." It took her 13 years to write Atlas Shrugged. Can you imagine working on a book for 13 years? She decided the theme could best be developed in the world of railroads and steel. If she were going to write about men working in these settings, she must know all she could. So she studied the problems and the history of heavy industry. She interviewed railroad and steel executives. She even went to Wyoming and drove along the exact route starting in Cheyenne, where she planned the railroad in her novel would run. 7 years to write Fountainhead. 13 years to write Atlas Shrugged. Does that mean she would write for a few hours a day, a couple of days a week? Let me quote. She drove herself at a ruthless schedule. She worked 7 days a week for as many hours each day as she was able to write. It was not unusual for her to eat dinner at midnight. There was one period of especially intense work when she did not step out of her apartment for 33 days. Were her illustrations and descriptions born from natural ability? Michelangelo At age 23, he sculpted the Pietà, one of the greatest artworks of all time, when he was only 23. How is it possible to explain how he could do this? How much schooling and education and practicing and sculpting can one do by age 23? Let me give you just one example from the book, The Agony and the Ecstasy. In his early years, little was known about the anatomy of the human body. How could he become the sculptor he planned to be if he didn't know the workings of every part of the human body? Bone, blood, brain, muscle, tendon, skin. A sculptor could not portray tension, conflict, strain, unless he saw every fiber at work that was shaping the power and the drive. He must learn anatomy. But how? Become a surgeon? That would take years. And even if he could, he would only be allowed to do 2 dissections a year with a group. The year was about 1490. He was a teenager. There were no books or drawings in a library such as we have today. His thoughts even considered the graveyard, but he knew he would be discovered, and the penalty was death. Finally, he remembered that the poor were laid to rest in the monastery until burial. After much thought and daring courage, he obtained the key. At midnight, he made his way to the monastery. He stood for a moment rigid before the door to the dead room, and at this moment of commitment, he didn't know whether he dared face the task ahead. The dead room was small, about 8 feet by 10 feet, no windows. In the center of the room, wrapped in a burial sheet, was a corpse. It was the first time he'd been alone in a room with death, let alone locked in and on a sacrilegious errand, and he was more frightened than he'd ever been in his life. Read the details if you like. To some, the details might seem gory, as every night at midnight, night after night, he went to the dead room with one small candle to dissect a human body. To me, it's a fascinating story of a teenage boy who was willing to face death, to work all night long in fear, in a small room with an odor he would smell for days, to learn about the muscles, the organs, the fibers, to learn all he could about the human body he would sculpture and paint. At age 23, he sculpted one of the great works of all time. He once said, "If people knew how hard I work to get my mastery, it wouldn't seem so wonderful after all." How many people have to watch their weight? How many look at others and envy them because they are naturally thin, because they don't have to watch their weight? Sammy Davis Jr., naturally thin? In his book, Yes, I Can, he said, "I don't diet, but I don't stuff myself either. I love desserts as much as the next guy, but I never eat them. And if I have potatoes one night, I won't have them again for 2 months. I eat until I'm not hungry anymore. And if there's still food on my plate, I leave it. And if I have ham and eggs, I don't follow them with coffee cake and a jelly donut." I always thought he was just built that way. Is it natural? He said, "I love desserts as much as the next guy, but I never eat them." How has Jackie Kennedy Onassis kept her famous figure? At a well-known restaurant in New York, where she has dined for more than 20 years, the owner says her meal is always something simple and plain, like a piece of broiled fish with lemon and a plain salad and coffee. He said she has never once eaten dessert. Is she naturally thin? One of the great moments in history was the day Neil Armstrong became the first man on the moon. How many thousands of men wanted to be chosen for the astronaut program? Was Neil Armstrong born with the natural abilities needed? When he was 8, he put together his first model airplane. This was the beginning of an entire assembly line of model airplanes. The thing he loved most to do was to ride his bike 2 miles to a small service airport where 3 small planes were kept to train pilots. By age 14, he was there so often that finally an instructor began talking to him, and soon he was allowed to help the mechanic, and then he was told he could learn to fly. From then on, every penny he earned went for flying lessons. It took him 23 hours of work to pay for 1 lesson. Does anything mean so much to you that you would work for 23 hours in order to pay for one lesson? His goal was to get a flying license by his 16th birthday. Was it natural ability that allowed him to be the first man on the moon, or by age 16, had he already developed through work, interest, time, a knowledge of aviation? Couldn't Walt Disney have been a big executive who drove to his office around 9, played a little golf, had lunch at a nearby club, and then had dinner guests at his fabulous home several times a week? He worked 14 hours a day and supervised all his projects. His work wasn't a job. It was his life. It was what he lived to do. When Neil Sedaka was 8, he was practicing the piano so much, his parents had to bring his food to the piano. He practiced 6 to 7 hours a day. By 13, he was writing songs with a 16-year-old. They wrote a song every single day for several years. The more songs they wrote, the easier it became, and the better the songs were. By 16, he was writing national hits. But he said, my whole existence was waking up, writing songs, and recording.
Do it like you done it when you meant it. Baby, bring it back to where it used to be.
Was it natural ability or a desire to excel? A total love and commitment to what he was doing, thinking about it all the time. He said, my whole existence was waking up, writing songs, and recording at age 16. The choice is yours. You may not want to be a Neil Sedaka or an Ayn Rand or a Neil Armstrong. No one is suggesting that you work 12 hours a day every day or 16 hours a day every day. You must decide what is right for your life, what your priorities will be. But as you think about these people who have excelled, remember that what they had in common was not natural ability, nearly as much as their total dedication to excellence. They worked hours, months, years to achieve what was important to them. Unless you are willing to make this commitment, it is unfair to continue with the myth that they excelled because they were born with natural ability. When Jim Ryan was in high school, he said he would break the 4-minute mile. No high school student had ever done it before. In 9th grade, he couldn't even make the track team. The junior high coach said he would never be a runner. The next year in high school, he came in second in his first mile and won every high school mile he was in after that. Jim Ryan knew if he could break the 4-minute mile, it would be because he improved a lap at a time. As a sophomore in high school, he staggered out of bed at 4:30 in the morning, delivered a paper route, and ran 6 miles before breakfast. Then he ran another 6 miles after school. When he was 14 and 15, no matter what the weather was, he ran every day through ice and blizzards and 100-degree heat. He was the first high school student to ever break the 4-minute mile. Was it natural ability? Or running 12 miles a day, every day? I remember watching Peggy Fleming skating at the Olympics. What a natural style she had as she skated away with the gold medal. She had worked for 10 years for that medal. From age 9 to age 19, she had practiced 11 months a year, 6 days a week, 5 hours a day, in addition to a full school load. What about Jesse Owens, who competed in the Olympics in Germany in 1936? Hitler was in power. I wonder how he felt the day he began the competition with Hitler in the stands, knowing he had repeatedly told his people that Germans were superior, blacks were inferior. He won 4 gold medals in track and field. Hitler may never have congratulated him, but he was a hero to the world. He was cheered everywhere he went, through Europe, America. He made speeches. There were parades honoring him. An Olympic champion. A natural athlete. As a little boy, he lived in Oakville, Alabama. He was the only son who couldn't help because he was so sickly that every winter he came down with pneumonia. Several winters he almost died. He said the coach of his school asked him to go out for track in 5th grade, not because he saw a potential track champion, but because he was so frail. After several months, his legs still looked like pieces of straw. It was because he was weak and thin that he began to run to build his body. He began to work harder and run more than the boy down the street who was born with a natural running ability. And he won 4 gold medals. Wilma Rudolph, 17th child in a family of 19 children. She was stricken as a young child with double pneumonia, scarlet fever, and polio, which paralyzed her legs. After years of medical treatment at a hospital, long hours of daily massaging her weak legs, at the age of 8, she began to walk with a leg brace. At 13, she was running like other girls her age. She became the first American woman to win 3 gold medals at the Olympic Games. She came home acclaimed as the world's greatest runner, a girl who couldn't walk until she was 8. Was she born to be an Olympic champion? Wilma recently said, without the brace, I would have been a different person altogether. I probably would never have done sports at all. It was because I was different that I wanted to excel. I wanted to be noticed. The interesting thing is that many people excel, not because they have a natural ability, but because they either have a physical handicap or because they feel different, not accepted, lonely. Who among us has not at one time or another felt alone? But with some, the loneliness was so deep and so lasting, it was what caused them to excel. Robin Williams was the only child of a Detroit automobile executive and grew up in a 30-room mansion. Other children avoided him, and he felt different. He said, I was lonely as a kid. Being funny and making others laugh was my way of making friends, of trying to get them to like me. Was his humor born out of natural ability or developed since childhood to get attention and affection? Others excel because they love what they do so much. They think about it all the time. They concentrate so much harder than the average person. All their thoughts and energies are focused on this one endeavor. It was certainly true of Vince Lombardi, perhaps the greatest football coach of all time. He concentrated. One day his wife drove him and a friend to practice. The friend sat on the front seat between them. Vince didn't say one word during the ride. He was so intent thinking about football. When he reached the stadium, he opened the car door, turned, and said, "Thanks, honey," and kissed the man sitting next to him. Another time, after a practice session, he showered and put on his socks and his shorts, shoes, his jacket, and his overcoat, and started to walk out of the stadium. The man at the gate stopped him. "Excuse me, Mr. Lombardi, but I think you should go back and put your pants on." He was so involved in football. He concentrated so hard and was so intense about the game that he could become oblivious to everything else. When Jimmy Carter was campaigning for the 1976 presidency, he didn't rely on natural ability when preparing a speech. He knew the value of working on one speech, one phrase, until it was exactly the way he wanted it to be. And then he would say it over and over and over. James Wooten wrote, he rarely changed an expression once it seemed to be effective. Each noun, each verb was carefully selected over weeks of preparation. Then he tested it here and he tested it there. In 1972 and 1973, when no one was listening, he took each word, each phrase, and he honed it and turned it and changed it, and then he etched it into his mind, right down to the minute inflections and pauses. A Carter speech was a Carter speech. Words would be exactly the same in the snows of New England, the cornfields of Iowa, the core of Harlem, or the sunshine of Florida. Once after a crowded press conference, a reporter complained that his answer had not been clear. Irritated, Carter asked if he wished him to repeat the answer. And when the reporter nodded, he did. word for word, comma for comma, gesture for gesture. For the past 16 years, addressing conventions and meetings has been my profession. And I've listened to other speakers, the best in America, the most exciting and dynamic speakers. I've heard them in various cities and in different years. And what may seem like an ad-lib comment or a new thought to an audience in Cleveland is the same one I've heard the speaker give in Dallas or Los Angeles, who was not stirred by Jesse Jackson's speeches.
And thus, with this tremendous power, the media has the responsibility to help inform us.
He inspired thousands of students in assemblies from Maine to California. If you heard him in Chicago, and then a month later in Atlanta, you heard the same phrases, the same ideas. He polished his presentations and gave them over and over and over until they were flawless. All speakers do. When I first began speaking, I expected the best MCs to be in our large cities. But I quickly learned that the size of the city has nothing to do with the excellence of people's abilities. One of the finest MCs I've ever heard was in charge of welcoming, introducing, and thanking people at the Chamber of Commerce banquet in Hereford, Texas. I was the banquet speaker. There were 2,000 people in the auditorium. He never referred to a note, and yet whatever the situation, he had just the right story to bring the house down with laughter. Such a talent, I thought, that at a reception in his home after the banquet, I noticed bookcases in almost every room, one shelf after another, with titles like How to Tell a Funny Story and This Year's Funniest One-Liners. He later told me that his hobby is to read and study speaking and humor. For years, every single day, instead of reading a mystery or watching television, he has been reading hundreds, thousands of funny stories, humorous examples. And he would underline, circle, or check those he liked best, and reread them often. At the banquet, when an unexpected situation arose, he could ad-lib the perfect one-liner. It may have been unplanned for that evening, but it was one of hundreds of stories and examples that he had tucked away in his mind, a reservoir of material that he could draw from. Cavett Robert is a dear friend of mine and one of the outstanding speakers in America today. He addresses an average of 8 conventions every week. Let me quote from a letter that he wrote to me. Last night I spoke in Dallas. This is the 3rd time in 60 days I've followed Paul Harvey. I sincerely believe he is the best speaker in America. I want very much to be the best. I hope that's not conceit. I've completely rewritten and revised my entire talk that I usually give. It's so far better than anything I've ever given. I rehearse it hours each day and night. After perhaps 1,000 more rehearsals, I hope I'll be comfortable enough to change to it. If I can ever truly master it, I will be among the best. Impatience is hard to take. I was in the audience when he later received the Outstanding Speaker of the Year award, and as he gave his dynamic acceptance talk, I wondered how many were looking at him, wishing they had his natural ability. Maybe you haven't had any real setbacks in life yet. Maybe you've been a leader or a natural athlete. You make friends easily. You're very attractive. You're always asked or chosen, invited to all the parties, and win the elections. Perhaps you're the ones I'm most concerned about. For example, in my experience in watching and participating in literally hundreds of pageants, I found that the prettiest girl never wins. She has always been appreciated and accepted for her natural beauty, and too often she's never had to develop her skills and her confidence. The girl who steps on the stage, who has worked hard, who has developed a strong person within, who has a confident walk because she has something to contribute, this girl is usually the winner. I remember particularly one year when I emceed the Miss North Carolina pageant. There were 60 girls who had won local pageants and who were competing for Miss North Carolina. When I arrived on Wednesday and met them, I saw one of the most beautiful girls I'd ever seen. There was no question in my mind that she would be the winner. The girls competed on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday nights, And by Saturday, the girl had completely faded into the background. She wasn't even one of the final 10. Other girls who weren't as pretty, but who had this vitality, confidence, the developed skills. These were the girls who were in the final 10. Jean Anderson wrote an interesting article in which she said, "When I was in college, my journalism professor said, 'You won't believe me, but it isn't necessarily the most talented of you who will make it over the long haul.' She said we didn't believe him. Of course the most talented of us would make it. Well, it's been 20 years since he said that, and he was right. The most talented, or at least the class superstars whom we considered to be the most talented, didn't make it. Why? A difficult question. Dr. Stella Chase, a professor of child psychiatry, suggested that some do so well without making any effort that they never learn how to make an effort. And those who have less talent can surpass them by hard work. She didn't say that all of you who have natural ability will not do well. She did say that if you have natural ability, you must discipline yourself to work hard. Or those who do not have the same ability, but who are working hard, will in time surpass you." Let me quote the exact words of Bob Pettit on this subject. Bob Pettit was a professional basketball player, a superstar. He scored more points than any other player in the history of basketball. He said, "The greatest thing that ever happened to me is that when I first picked up a basketball, I was terrible. If things come naturally, you may not bother to work at improving them." He scored more points than any other player in the history of basketball. There will be times when you will win something or accomplish something with luck. Most of us are blessed with luck at some time in our lives, and for those times, we must count our blessings. But a lifetime of fulfillment will not be based on luck. Some of you are doing so well, so easily right now, that you're not as fortunate in some ways as the ones who are struggling, who are learning that lasting achievement comes from total dedication and work, and not from natural ability. Having natural ability can be a blessing, and it can be a real handicap. It could be the greatest handicap you could possibly have.